It's the worst of the CBC for September 8th, 2019, the show where I watch the CBC so you don't have to. And you do not need to watch today because it's a half-an-hour loop. There are two stories. It's Hurricane Dorian, and congratulations, Bianca Andreescu, for being the first Canadian to win a singles major championship in tennis. Congratulations to her. Now, I'm going to do this a bit atypically because the news was not news. So the rating is really an NA because it's just Hurricane Dorian, Bianca Andreescu won. Hard to make that overly biased. So do your own rating. Doesn't matter. 5, 6, who cares, on the Rosemary Barton scale. I'm going to do the biggest omission first. Then I'm going to talk about the worst covered story of the day because I did watch a bit of the Sunday Roundtable and the discussion of sort of the Indigenous payout. There's a lot of things that need to be said that I don't think they said that are reason why this bad things keep happening. So the biggest omission, I think it's rather important that a Liberal MP, Ramesh Sangha, said that the Liberal Party capitulates to Khalistani extremists. This is true. And he said those Khalistani extremists are MPs and cabinet members. He's saying basically the top end of the Liberal Party is infected with Khalistani extremists. And this is true, and this is a problem. Now, if we want to play the sort of media game that they do, and where they say, like, well, since 9/11, the most deadly terrorist attacks are actually white nationalists, whatever, like, which actually isn't true. But if we take out all the Islamic terrorist attacks, then the most deadly terrorist attacks are actually this group. In Canada, though, if you want to say the most deadly terrorist group in Canada is actually the Khalistani movement, as they killed 280 Canadians in the Air India bombing and have, committed some major assassinations against high-end Indian cabinet ministers. That India said it doesn't send diplomatic delegations so much to Canada or has to do them under heavy guard because of the Khalistani extremists here. It's a big, big problem. It's a real big problem no one's talking about. Now, the fact that someone finally talked about it. Now, it'd be one thing if it's a conservative commentator like me said it. It'd be another thing if a conservative MP said it or an NDP MP said it. But the fact that a Liberal MP says that his own party is capitulating and to Khalistani extremists, and that is coming from the top ends of the party, and that doesn't make the CBC doesn't even make the Chiron all week. That shows you what 600, well, it's not even, that shows you the fault in state media, and that just shows you how horribly biased the CBC is. Could you imagine if that was Stephen Harper, who had extremists in the party, and then a conservative called him out for it? You'd never hear the end of it. Now, the worst story of the day is I actually covered this in the last episode, but I want to go back because this issue was discussed by 4 different people on the Sunday Roundtable, and this was the payments we're going to be giving out to Indigenous kids who were taken away from their families due to social services. Now, I don't really mind payouts to Indigenous kids who were taken away from their families wrongfully because of stupid policy. I mean, if I could survive $10.5 million to Omar Carter, I can survive $40,000 going to an Indigenous kid who has life ruined by the government. I'm fine with that. But the problem is just throwing money at the problem won't solve it. And on top of that, not talking about the real problem here is going to perpetuate the problem. Now, this happened this is policies laid out late 90s, early 2000s. This was the last Liberal government. So if we want to hear, Indigenous complaints about extreme racism that have hurt the society, and if you want to talk about Cornwallis and the scalping hundreds of years ago, I'm happy to have that conversation. But it's a lot harder to have that conversation. We're talking about like the John Chrétien government and what was really at play here. And I made the point, and none of the supposed conservatives on the panel have made this point, that the real problem here is, okay, so there's two things that are like, we have Jordan's principle, which he talked about, which is the federal government and the provincial governments can't be arguing over who pays for what. You have to give the service first, then argue afterwards, because he was denied essential medical care while the province and the federal government fought over it. Okay, good. Now, there's another rule that says that Indigenous kids on the reserve need to be entitled to the same services that non-Indigenous kids are entitled to off the reserves. At face value, that sounds fine. But what we have to understand is the reserve system is inherently broken and just will never be able to succeed. It is designed to fail. In the purest terms, it's a socialist nightmare. Okay? Indigenous people don't really own their land there. And well, yes, they do. Well, no, the tribe owns it, which means there's no individual ownership over land. So the individual autonomy over your own land isn't even there. On top of that, what we're doing is we have programs where you're just throwing money at a sub-government. So you have reserves, which are essentially ruled by different councils, some of them good, some of them bad. But when there's a lot of money just thrown at the top and there's no oversight, so when the federal government or provincial government says, okay, here's $500,000, and it goes to a committee of elders or whatever, well, what's the incentive here? Is that, most people think, okay, yeah, to use it to the community, well, but over long periods of time, when you have high amounts of money that is unwatched going to the top, the people in the community with malicious intentions who just want the money are going to rise to those positions naturally. And now you see hundreds of years of that. There's another problem where small reserves will never be able to have the same level of services that a major province or federal government will have to. It's the same thing for rural Canadians versus urban Canadians. If you just want to talk about pure white people, right? Like in the territories, right, it's hard to get the same level of medical services that it is to get in Toronto because of, population density and all that. So when you say, okay, we regulate that you must have the same level of services, and each reserve is built of a tribe, and, so let's say there's a tribe of, 10,000 people. Well, are you think you're going to get all the requisite amount of doctors and lawyers and nurses? You won't be able to fit, every single position from such a small sample size that you need other people to fill that in. That's how small towns get that. The problem is the native reserves have so many quote unquote benefits that they remain isolated, so they can't even get that extra in. So the system is designed to fail. And because we have a system designed to fail and a law saying you must get the same level of services here and there, well, that's why you had social services workers who just through good intentions government, good intentions and this sort of Trudeauist idea, we're going to be fairness, and all these laws and regulations that look good to the Indigenous. And then you had decades of politicians saying, I'm going to pass this law that says you have to be nice to these people, and here's more services and more things you're entitled to. Well, this gets into a government mess, and who's enacting this but the government? So when you have child services coming in and saying, oh, okay, these kids are not getting the same services they would get outside, legally we have to get them the same services, and they can't be here in the reserve, what happens? They take those kids away, and that's the worst thing. So this is the real problem we have, and this is the main reason why so many Indigenous kids were ripped away from their families. It was good intentions government creating all these good intentions laws and stacking them on top of each other onto a failing system that it ended in catastrophe. And no one's talking about this, right? No one's talking about, we actually have to fix the structural problems in the reserves. Because let's be honest, when we talk about, saving Indigenous culture, in 1607, the year before Samuel de Champlain got here, does everyone really want to go back to 1607, right? When we're talking about saving Indigenous culture, we can have these conversations about language and music and culture and stories, but no one really, Indigenous people, they want cars, they want cell phones, they want to be able to take their kids to soccer practice, they want to be able to watch hockey on TV, right? We have to talk about these things honestly. So I think this issue is actually going to get a spot on the Wednesday show at the end. Just my views on how the left views Indigenous issues and how harmful it is, because it's a really important issue, and I do think the path forward and a lot of things that can save us from the radical left actually have to do with real reconciliation with the Indigenous from a legitimate conservative point of view. So I want to outline that further on Wednesday night. So thank you so much for watching. This is the worst of the CBC. Give it whatever rating you did, because there really was no news, so you don't need to watch.